My name is Andrew Barendse, and I am very thankful. I'm grateful to moderate what is now the concluding session for IIC 2020 conference. The session is really about digital transformation for all. And just by way of introduction, before the pandemic, the regulatory rulemaking process was mostly settled. It was largely predictable. Of course, there was varying levels of success in responding to changes in technology, markets and policy, but by and large, the regime was settled, predictable, and perhaps moderate success. And then the pandemic happened and really called into question both our processes and outcomes. And in the case of South Africa, the response with regards to the process was unprecedented in terms of cooperation, in terms of coordination between policymakers and regulators and all interested and affected parties. Just the response to cooperate and to coordinate was unprecedented, and the outcomes was hugely effective, both in terms of the package in responding to the pandemic, in terms of rights, new rights that was given to operators and new benefits to consumers. And so suddenly in a short period, the impact of the pandemic of process and outcomes was met with this unprecedented response and package and benefits consumer. So this session is really about celebrating those responses, those initiatives, those steps to the pandemic. And the example that I've used in South Africa, of course, has been duplicated across national countries and internationally and regionally. And so this concluding session, I hope, is going to be to celebrate those initiatives, to identify them, to describe them, to celebrate them, because at some point, the emergency measures will stop. The supplementary regulations and the supplementary notices that was meant to fill during the period will be withdrawn. The obligations and the benefits will cease. And then once again, the gaps will be made bare. And so we really want to use this session to draw from those lessons, those interventions, those initiatives, and to map to map this transition to the new normal. And so this session again is digital transformation for all. It's the restart agenda. We're simply going to identify some of those gaps. We're going to describe the steps taken, and then see the extent to which this can assist as we transition to the new normal. I'm assisted by a very, very able panel, a very competent panel, a very professional panel. I'd just like to introduce the panel so that you can get a sense of the contributions that they will make. You have already been introduced to Professor Yu, who from the University of Pennsylvania, so he's part of the panel. We welcome him. We have Rebecca Arbogast. She is Senior Vice President, Global Public Policy, Comcast, NBC and Universal. We have Mario Fromow, who is the Commissioner, Federal Institute of Telecommunications, Mexico. We have Professor Antonio Zaballos. He's the Telecoms Lead Specialist for the Inter-American Development Bank. And we have Arisa Siong. She's the Director, Public and Regulatory Affairs, External Relations Asia for the Telenor Group. So a wide range of expertise that covers developed and developing economies that really will be able to speak to the topic and the theme of digital transformation for all, overcoming this digital divide. So the first participant panelist I'd like to invite to share her views is Rebecca. And Rebecca, you have some of the most exciting private sector projects that you can allude to and share with us as well. So let me introduce and welcome you and ask you to share your views. Rebecca.
Thank you very much, and thanks to IIC for including me and letting me join this good panel. As I said to the IIC director earlier today, I think this session, this year's event has gone so well remotely, and somewhat worried that she's not going to bring us all together in the future in person. So I hope we can meet in person soon. So 2020 was an uncommon year. When everything shut down in March, many systems suffered and totally strained to keep up with the demand. In the months that followed, we couldn't get enough COVID testing, and probably most famously in the US, we couldn't get enough toilet paper. And yesterday there was an article in the New York Times that there's been a run on common antacid. But as we shifted overnight to doing everything at home, America's internet networks were there when we needed them. Traffic surged. At Comcast, in 3 months, we experienced a growth that we usually see over 1 to 2 years. It was a stress test completely unlike anything our engineers had ever seen, but the networks held up. Just to give you some sense of that as a data point, in April, at peak hours, more than 95% of our nodes, a node covers about 250 to 300 homes, operated in the green zone, which means they had excess capacity available. Only about 5% were in what we would call the yellow zone, which means that they were somewhat stressed and we had to pay attention to them, but they didn't affect the consumer experience, and none were in the red zone. So a number of factors contributed to keeping the internet from breaking during that early surge. First, ISPs invested nearly $2 trillion over the last 25 years, and what that bought the country was a network that had capacity and resilience. Second, at least for us, and this goes to one of the points that Andrew made, a lot of what we have done in dire straits in this period of time are changes that we hope will be continuing. And one for us was that we really radically accelerated incorporating AI and machine learning into our network diagnostics so that they could dynamically mitigate problems that we were seeing in the network before they affected customers. Third, we plowed even more into the network. We augmented our capacity in those targeted zones that were under stress at a rate that was 3 to 6 times higher than at pre-COVID levels. And finally, and not to get too sentimental, but our people, the frontline technical teams, they were out there in the field adding capacity to the network whenever it was needed, and they were also inside hospitals and healthcare centers, making sure that they had the additional capacity that they needed as well. So I indulge me as I quote Charles Fishman, who wrote in The Atlantic in May. He said, amidst so much highly visible dysfunction in the American response to the coronavirus, the internet is the unsung hero of the pandemic. It has stayed on because people out there are keeping it on. So one key lesson from the pandemic is that our networks were resilient and supported hundreds of millions of people to allow them to suddenly shift to home for work and for educating their kids. And we can't afford to undermine that in the future. But another key lesson from the pandemic is that we need to get serious about getting everyone online. There are 2 gaps that I want to flag, and we can talk about them, I'm sure, more as the hour goes by. But the first is deployment, which means just, do you have the physical network out there? Despite years of federal and state spending in our country on broadband deployment, about 4% of Americans, or about 15 million people, still live in areas that don't have any access to the network. That's according to the most recent government data, and we'll probably discuss this later as well. We all know that that understates the unconnected. So the gap is primarily in rural areas where the low population density means that it just isn't, there's not enough people, not enough revenue to support a private sector build alone. The government here has made important changes and reforms to what we call the high-cost universal service program, and smart policy choices will continue to get the job done efficiently. I think we're actually on a pretty good path in this country. First, government subsidy programs need to be focused so that they are going to areas where people don't have any service. It seems obvious, but it still needs to be said. Second, funding programs should take advantage of all the contributions that all the different ISPs can make with their various technologies. That stretches the funding better, and it allows for more diversity of solutions that will be more suitable depending upon the particular community. And then finally, funding should be distributed through competitive bidding mechanisms like reverse auctions. We just finished one here in the last week or two, and they got winning bidders for 99% of the eligible locations. So that's been an important area of reform. So the federal program should honor these basic policy principles, but there are also some good state deployment funding models out there, which we participated in. Just as an example, we partnered with the state of Massachusetts, and we brought gigabit broadband to 9 unserved rural towns in Western Massachusetts. So that's a deployment gap. The second gap that the COVID crisis has highlighted is in adoption. By some estimates, the share of Americans who have access to the network but who don't subscribe is about 5 times greater than those who don't have access to any network. So it's a much larger problem in terms of the number of people who are affected, and I would say it's also a more challenging problem to solve. Comcast has worked for nearly a decade on the adoption issue. We launched our Low-Income Internet Essentials program in 2011, and we've connected 8 million low-income Americans to high-speed broadband, which makes us the largest adoption program in the country. And the pandemic has only just redoubled our commitment to the program. But again, industry can't solve it alone. The federal government has a critical, important role to play. First, we need immediate long-term relief for those families who are struggling most from the financial pressure of COVID. Comcast, working along with Verizon and Charter, developed a proposal for Congress to create an emergency broadband benefit that would give low-income households a monthly discount to purchase internet service, which would leverage the existing private sector low-income programs that are out there. But second, and longer term and more ambitious, we need to work together to make sure that there's a sustainable subsidy program for low-income families to buy home broadband, just like we have programs for low-income families to help them purchase food and health care. So to wind up, I would say these are not new problems, right? We've been, at least in our country, and I'm sure in everywhere else, we've been struggling with these for years, and we've been saying for years that we need to address these gaps. But we've got a once in a lifetime, once in a century pandemic that means we really finally have to focus, and we have to act, and we have to solve these problems together. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rebecca, for those introductory comments and views. I'm going to invite Mario to share his views, especially I think some of those best practices that have evolved in Mexico with regard to spectrum release. Mario, over to you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. First, I would like to thank the International Institute of Communications, especially to my friends Chris Chapman, Andrea Millwood, and Amanda Crabbe for the invitation to participate in this very important event. Also, it's a pleasure to be here with Christopher, Andrew, Rebecca, Antonio, and Arisa. Thank you for this opportunity. I am one of the 7 commissioners of the Federal Institute of Telecommunications of Mexico, the IFT. The IFT is the regulator and also the competition authority for the telecommunication and broadcasting sectors in Mexico. And it is my pleasure to share with you briefly in my first intervention what the Telecommunication Institute is doing during this new normal in order to support the telecommunication and ICT sectors here in Mexico. Especially, we are implemented some measures that we to face this COVID-19 pandemic. Actually, we have developed several recommendation action in order to maintain the effective provision of telecommunication services in Mexico, and I would like to highlight some of them. First, we developed a microsite called Face to Coronavirus. The telecom are on your site. In this website, we provide some recommendations related to responsible use of telecommunication network, tools for planning consumption in response to change in user activities, such as the data consumption simulator, measures taken by the IFT and operators in response to the contingency, as well as official information published by the Ministry of Health, among other material that you can have in that website. Also, the IFT has issued some recommendations for users in order to avoid saturating the telecom network. We ask them to prioritize the use of internet for informational, work, education, and health purpose, restrict using of video conference or video calls, and give preference in sometimes to voice communications, it is possible. Also set a schedule with lower data traffic, for example, in the afternoon or in the evening, to download heavy files, movie, videos, or play online. As this is because as Mexico, as another country, we experience an increase of traffic in sometimes around 50%. But it is very interesting because many of these increase were in the fixed network, not in the mobile networks. But the Mexican operators network responds very well to this situation. I mean, it demonstrates that they are resilient for this kind of events. Also, we asked to our mobile phone user, to mobile phone operators, to give the users a free update information on the pandemic due to coronavirus. I mean, for free SMS, and through coordination between the FIT, the telecommunication on this three, and the federal government, the following was the site. The user of this service will receive free SMS with announcement and other updated information about the COVID-19. Sending the SMS will be a permanent form of communication for the duration of this health emergency, with the aim that the population has timely access to official information sources, complying with the fundamental right of everyone to receive information such as the Constitution mandates. Also, a very important issue was the continuation of the telecommunication and broadcasting services. Given the measure ordered by the General Health Council to face the health emergency here in Mexico, the Institute has exhorted federal, state, and municipal authorities to carry out the necessary action to guarantee that the workers of the telecommunication and broadcasting concessionaires, as well as the related services have the sufficient and wide facilities to carry out the telecommunication and broadcasting services. I mean the maintenance, and also to assure the effective operation of these services, because as in other parts of the world there were some restriction on mobility issues. Also, we asked to the Mexican operators, both mobile and fixed, to offer something that we call emergency communication plan, in order to give their customer some communication free of charge. Some, for example, in the mobile sector, they offer 100 minutes of voice for national calls, and also 150 SMS free of charge, in order to try to communicate the user here in Mexico. And finally, I want to mention that also the IFT makes information material available in the internet in indigenous language on the use of telecommunication during this emergency, in order to provide information to this indigenous population on recommendation for the use of telecommunication services. The Institute makes available on internet information in language as Mazahua, Tzotzil, Zapotec, and Nahuatl on the use of telecommunications. And this is very important because they have information or recommendation to take advantage, for example, of the benefits of telecommunication, as well as prevention and cleaning measures to prevent the spread of the virus, and some practice to avoid saturation in the use of internet. So we have some videos and infographics in that language in our site, and it's very important information for that indigenous population here in Mexico. Thank you. I leave my first intervention here. Thank you, Andrew.
Yes, thank you very much, Mario, for your contribution from those practices in Mexico. I'm going to call on Professor Antonio just to share his views on some of the developments in Latin and Central America. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you very much to the IIC for another successful event. To be honest, it's always great to be part of this family, of this community that you have created. I think that, as I mentioned in the past, to me, working with the IIC and participating in the panels is one of the best of many that are taking place exactly these days. Going directly to your question, Andrew, let me just highlight what we have observed at the Inter-American Development Bank, specifically in the Latin America and the Caribbean region. The situation that we have seen is, I have to say, I'm totally surprised, impressed, overwhelmed with the level of commitment of the different countries on this particular matter. So just let me give you a particular data so that you can have a better sense on what is the situation that we as a bank are facing, and particularly me and my team, we are dealing with. In early this year, we were working in approximately 4 countries. When I'm saying working, I mean we were having specific loan programs in those 4 countries. As of today, so after 10 months, the number of countries in which we are working with investment projects has risen up to 11. So let's say that in just 10 months, there were 7 countries out of 26 that are IDB members that has requested some particular support in terms of infrastructure deployment and the need of improving connectivity across the different users and different sectors. So this gives you an idea of the importance of the topics that Rebecca was mentioning. I think connectivity is taking momentum, and I would like to say this is not just because of the period that we are facing and afterwards everything will become normal. I think that this is going to be the new normal coming from now on. However, it's very important that when it's about connectivity, I would say that there are two particular things that we have observed. First is the need to have better public services, and in this regard, to have more public institutions connected. So I would say that in those 7 additional projects that we have been working on, connecting schools, connecting hospitals, connecting police stations has become one of the top priorities for the governments. In addition to that, another aspect that we realize in Latin America is the huge dependency that we have from international hubs. So the problem that we are facing is that the countries are not interconnected. They are not interoperational. As a consequence of that, if you have a user from Peru that is checking a newspaper from Colombia, probably has to come first to Miami, get contact the server, and then go back again to Colombia, then from Colombia again to the server, and then from the server back to Peru. So this is a major issue. It's not only a major issue in terms of the international connectivity, but it's also an issue in terms of the creation of local content and the creation of the digital ecosystem that is required in the region. So we have a very interesting initiative that is ongoing. The government of Chile is thinking precisely about deploying a submarine cable between the South Cone, in particular Chile, and Asia Pacific, so that they have an alternative route to get connectivity at international level, so that not only more competition is brought, but also more quality of services and reduction in prices eventually. The second point that I wanted to stress is the issue related to digital skills. This is another important thing. I think that we have to escape from average data, and I think that Professor Yu is the master on this. Talking about average in most of the occasion lead us to some misleading actions and misleading policies. We need to narrow down, zoom in, and start having a specific description of what is going on at rural areas and what is going on at a level below national-wide. So in this particular regard, initiatives such as the government of Mexico is precisely involved in a very nice initiative that is precisely defining digital skill programs, taking into account the level of digital maturity that the different states is facing. So that it is not just digital skills for the country. No, it's digital skills taking into account the digital maturity that those regions are facing. And this is going to be critical not only from the social standpoint, but also from the productivity standpoint. Next one, I think that Commissioner Fromow has mentioned extensively, and again, the case of Mexico and IFT, I think that is a very good example for the region, and I would like to congratulate IFT. The regulatory aspects related to spectrum, regulatory aspects related to infrastructure sharing, and also regulatory aspects related to Universal Service Fund and how to manage the usage of Universal Service Fund is going to be critical. Last, I don't want to monopolize the discussion. I would like to highlight the point that Rebecca was mentioning before about funding. I think that we, at this moment of time, according to our estimation, we are facing a gap of around $69 billion to catch up with the average of the OECD countries. And there is an issue in terms of financing, and there is a role for public sector. Of course, there is a role for private sector, and there is a need to understand that without the support from the public, either in terms of, let's say, certainty regulation, and also in terms of particular subsidies, as Rebecca was mentioning, to facilitate the deployment and to accelerate that deployment in particular areas, the private sector are not going to be capable of reaching out those areas. So the same way as we were having particular public intervention when it's about reaching out levels of universality for electricity, nowadays we have to start having concerns and public intervention, both policy and in terms of public policies and financing, to reach out levels of universal digitalization across the country. I just stop here, and I'm sure that we will have time for further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Antonio, for those insights from the Development Bank. If I can just introduce and invite the last panelist to share her views. It's Arisa, just in the perspective from Asia. So we've had Mexico, we've had Latin America, we had the US. I think useful insights from Asia will benefit all. Over to you, Arisa.
Thank you, Andrew, and good evening to all. I'm based out of Singapore, so it's a little bit late for me, but I'm very happy to be here. Thank you to the IIC for the invitation. And I really do want to echo a lot of the points that the other panelists have made, and I agree with many of them. And I think first and foremost, digital resilience is hugely important. That's one thing that the pandemic has shown us. And we've seen that the more digitally mature have been able to cope with the lockdowns and the disruptions to supply chains better. We see this in our own operations, in fact. And we've been thinking about a digital future for Asian markets for a while now, even though in some of these markets, they are not as digitally mature as our operations in the Nordics, but we thought thinking ahead would be useful nonetheless. And what this meant was when the pandemic hit, we were able to pivot and adjust very quickly to what I like to call telco from home. And that is, we were able to both operate our technology operation centers remotely, as well as utilize digital channels to engage our customers, be it pivoting to selling mobile phones and other services via Facebook Live and other social media channels, as well as using things like chatbots more and more to deal with the increased customer inquiries that were coming online via our online channels. So it really allowed us to cope in a very nimble fashion. That's the one thing I'll say. And then, this digital resilience is just going to be even more important going forward as digital economies grow. What this means is that, future-ready digital infrastructure is really going to become a key component of digital resilience, because we've seen that the more sort of future-ready networks have been able to cope better. Rebecca talked about the spikes in traffic that Comcast experienced. Mobile networks are no different. We saw when the lockdown hit between 20 to 30% spikes in data traffic, but we were able to cope after a while, because modernizing our networks is something that we focused a lot on over the past few years. And I think, and Professor, you will be familiar with this, the empirical research also does show that countries with more advanced broadband infrastructure have managed to cope better with the spikes in data traffic, because there's just sort of more spare capacity to call on and to scale on, and the ability to pivot to shifting traffic demands within the network. And to Christopher's point as well previously about how it's not going to be just important getting people online going forward, but the quality of the connection is going to be very important, because it determines what we were able to do on top of the connectivity layer. So all the activities, the innovation, and we already know today, as we partake in this panel, that video-heavy applications will be core and center, alongside a lot of other more modern applications that will come. And this is going to zap quite a lot of bandwidth. But this means that there is significant option value in investing in future networks. And it's important to create a conducive environment for such investments. We need predictability and certainty, as Professor Antonio has said. And again, I like Christopher's point about the sustainability of investment being very important. The thing about sustainability is you have to sustain it, So that's the key. Yeah, it doesn't come from nowhere. So we see that in many markets, discounted prices for connectivity access, complementary connectivity communication services were provided as relief or as aid. Discounted prices, or in a market like Myanmar where the government lifted the floor price that was previously in place to allow prices to fall so that more customers could get online, it's not necessarily going to be very sustainable for investment in the long run. And I want to position this in the context of thinking about 5G, where the investment requirements are going to be even more onerous. Likewise, the view sometimes governments have on how specific taxes or high spectrum prices can plug fiscal debts in the short term is it's slightly myopic in that it doesn't take this long-term perspective of what the value of investments in next generation digital infrastructure will bring in terms of benefits and growth as an engine of growth for the digital economy. This also means that we need certain policy frameworks and regulation to support the challenging business case that such significant investments demand. So spectrum sharing and network sharing is very relevant. And Professor Antonio also mentioned the scope for partnerships, right? So between the private and public sector will be important. But I think also, thinking about partnerships across the vertical digital supply chain, that is more novel, but then needs to be balanced against net neutrality rules. So I think increasingly a more flexible approach to policy making will be important because we need to adapt and pivot a lot more. And this means that policy frameworks should certainly be technology neutral or agnostic, so that we are able to have that nimble response if and when needed. I think in general, it should also be more outcome focused and less prescriptive. So to allow for the more variability and more options for industry to then meet policy objectives in a cost efficient manner. Lastly, I just want to talk about the sort of infrastructure investment and network deployment side of things is very important. I think an even more important topic is about the usage gap, which Rebecca also touched upon earlier. And I want to bring out one stat that she mentioned just now about how the adoption gap in the US is 5 times that of the connectivity gap. So the difference in the number of people who have connectivity but don't use, right? And the people who do not have connectivity. Just for perspective, in Asia, in South Asia, the coverage gap is 6% and the usage gap is 61%. So that's a 10x difference. In East Asia and Pacific, the coverage gap is 2%, and the usage gap is 38%. So that's a 19x difference. So when we're talking about Asia, these sort of the distance between the usage gap and the connectivity gap is actually far, far wider. So there's far more traction to be gained in closing the usage gap in terms of improving accessibility of communication services to more people. And I think here, the digital skills, building the right digital skills and competencies for individuals and for companies is very important to help everyone participate in the digital economy and not get left behind in the COVID recovery. The other day, I saw a post by my friend with kids that really resonated with me that said that, we don't let kids on bikes without a helmet, so why would we let them on the internet without monitoring software for online safety? And the same could be argued for online safety skills. It's not just the tools, but we need the skills as well. And child online safety is a clause that is very close to Telenor's heart. In fact, our child online safety program, DigiWorld, celebrated its 10th anniversary this year. And this year, we actually translated and localized the DigiWorld content to each of our Asian markets so that we can reach more children. And I'm proud to share that we will be able to train about 4 million children in online safety by the end of 2022. But I think focusing on the more vulnerable parts of the population in general is important too, right? Because we know that there is a gender gap, there's a rural-urban gap, and we know that the poor do not have the same opportunities for acquiring digital competencies as the more privileged does. And to this end, in October, we also kicked off a collaboration with the Directorate of Science and Technology in Pakistan to train 500 aspiring female entrepreneurs on digital skills. And I think this type of efforts that that is really important, as well as the network side of things. And lastly, I just want to mention a point about SMEs, because they are the bedrock of much of the economies in Asia. And they just don't have the same opportunities to digitalize as the larger companies do, because digital services tend not to be geared towards them, and they don't have the same sort of digital education and access to talent as larger companies. So I think it's very important to provide that support for SMEs, and throughout our Asian markets, we have worked with government stakeholders as well as other partners, including Google in Pakistan and Prime Bank in Bangladesh, to support SMEs both on getting grants for digitalization as well as helping them upskill digitally.
Thank you very much, Arisa, for those perspectives and those views from Asia. Professor Yu, I was just wondering, so you've sort of outlined your lessons, if you like, your 5 lessons, and for the future, and I got a sense that it may have been restricted to the US mainly, but I'd like your insights and your contributions from perspectives from some of the other regions, but in particular, is there a way of ranking? In other words, the lessons that you've outlined, when you look across the different regions, is there a way of ranking to say which one of those lessons are more relevant for specific regions, for specific economies, for specific areas? I just wanted your insights, I guess, on the application of the lessons in other regions, and is there a ranking or an ordering or a prioritization that may sort of assist in that?
So the answer, I think, is clearly yes, but can you hear me now? All right. So the answer is clearly yes, but I wouldn't do it region by region. I also think, even within countries, individual countries, we have to be more targeted. So if I were to try to sum up a message, I was trying to think of, as I was hearing these excellent presentations from my many friends that I'm speaking with and some new acquaintances, I was trying to think about this. I was trying to figure out if I could encapsulate in a sentence. I would try to say the approach needs to be, at the same time, more holistic and more granular, which is sort of contradictory. But the holistic part is the the emphasis that every speaker placed on the need to foster digital skills and to really think about the adoption-related issues. And I think that has been a blind spot, and I think that spans all regions. And I think that and to be clear, Andrew, the work I'm doing in One World Connected actually is largely focused on the developing world as well. And so many of the insights and the points I made are not restricted to the world, to the US. And I would say the issue on adoption is a global issue. We've seen it in surveys in the US, in the UK, in the EU, but we've seen it in surveys in India, in Brazil, in all these other in other parts of the world as well. It's a universal problem. What I find is the one-size-fits-all solution instinct, I think, is misplaced. So, for example, one of the interesting facts that we've seen is the effect of the pandemic on mobile connectivity has been very different in the developing world than in the US. It's increased on cellular traffic, has increased, but only modestly in the US. It's been much larger than that in the developing world, which is much more dependent on cellular traffic and has fewer opportunities to offload onto fixed line Wi-Fi based networks. That's fascinating to me. And what we're discovering is we have to do, each country has a different set of issues, but even within each country, there are different issues that have to be faced, which is, for example, in many countries, spectrum is an issue in many countries, but in rural areas, spectrum is relatively cheap. And I must congratulate Commissioner Fromow, and what's an experiment they've done in Mexico is they've issued experimental licenses in rural areas to try to enable different kinds of connectivity and different business models on sort of micro cellular networks on a single cell tower basis that connect backhaul that way and provide paid Wi-Fi. And what you're starting to see is this sort of plural sense of trying to get a targeted. Now, to try to answer your question directly, If I were to try to prioritize on some level, I'm talking adoption is a critical issue, but if you have no connectivity, it doesn't matter. Quality is an important issue, but unless you have a sustainable infrastructure, which you can actually create that and sustain it, it doesn't matter. I do think you have to pay attention to those other issues at the same time to make sure you have a growth path for quality. And you think about adoption issues too, because many people have created networks that no one adopts, and that's a problem. But when I think about sustainability, the thing that really leaps out at me is many people really focus on CapEx, capital expenditure. I don't care how expensive or how cheap the network is. If its operating expenses are too high and it's operating in the red, it will go bankrupt or will constantly require infusions of cash. And so what I've discovered is that operating expenses is as key to sustainability as capital expenses. And that often the problem that many places have, in particularly in very rural areas, is backhaul. And so we think we're very much focused on capital expense for the last mile. But this is an example of you have to create a sustainable infrastructure. And I know in some parts of the world where we're working in Africa, they're relying on satellite backhaul because they don't have affordable, reliable backhaul through other means. I'll close with one last thought that Arissa really emphasized, is the gender gap and the vulnerable populations. I think a lot of us who are technophiles and in this industry believe in it and had this faith that improving connectivity would float all boats and improve everyone's lot. We now know the sad reality is that as we've connected more people to the world, the gender gap has gotten worse. We've seen the impact of COVID on women and on low-income families has been much, much worse. And these are going to be persistent issues that we have to work on. Just to share with you, we are free to publicize this, but it's not actually, I haven't released the announcement yet. We're working on a grant right now from GSMA to study the impact of mobile internet adoption on the socioeconomic well-being of women in Bangladesh and Ghana. And this is the kind of work to me one of the things that I find is really critical to start a dialogue to move outside of communications ministries. All of us value connectivity for its own sake, but to mobilize broader political support out of health ministers, education ministers, finance ministers, and most importantly, prime ministers, we need to actually do the additional study of how connectivity creates benefits in the real world, because no one gets a connection for its own sake. It's for the things you can do with it. And to operationalize that with immediate relevance, it's really tying to something Antonio said about digital skills, which is we learned in digital skills training, you really need to show people what it's going to do for you to get people to adopt. It's not this abstract thing. And you need to show government policymakers how it connects and to mobilize that kind of support and to try to actually get the kind of outcomes I think everyone on this panel and everyone attending this conference is committed to seeing happen in the future.
Thank you very much, Professor Yu. I have two questions. I'm going to present it to the panel. It may lend itself to one or two panelists more than others, but I guess everyone would be free and welcome to respond. The first one is, to what extent are device costs a barrier to adoption versus education? And what solutions are available to address this? So the first question is about device costs as a barrier to adoption versus education. And what solutions are there for device costs? The second question, it's rather more lengthier, but let me have a go at it. Advocates for connecting the unconnected wants subsidies for community networks and new innovative startups. So the advocates for connecting the connected, they want subsidies for community networks and new innovative startups. While the finance ministry worries about competition to the old incumbent state-owned telco. What is to be done? Are there any digital leaders, PMs and presidents who have overcome interagency fights and found consensus on key digital issues? So the one question is about device costs as an adoption, and the other one is about the tension, I guess, between public interest objectives of the finance ministry and competition, and really wanting to connect the unconnected, and how does one deal with interagency rivalry as a barrier to key digital progress. Over to the panelists. Feel free, those who want to contribute to either one.
Andrew, I would love to jump in on the device question because it gives me an opening to echo and support what Antonio and Christopher and Risa have said about adoption. So the device, all we know really in terms of data in the US is some research that both Pew and the Census Bureau have done, and they find the questions aren't always asked in the same way. The answers then are a little bit cloudy, but what we've seen over time is that you see three buckets of reasons that people give as the greatest reason that they don't connect to the internet, that they don't subscribe. One of them is the cost of the broadband service itself. That, to some people's surprise, actually over the last 5 years has declined as a factor. It's gone from about 30% to 20% of the main reason that people give for not adopting. The cost of the computer is roughly about the same. And there's, I think, a discussion going on within the universal service reform system about, do we only support the connectivity, or do we also support the devices? And I think that's become even more pronounced here as a barrier, as you've got families that have multiple people working from home and multiple kids schooling from home at the same time, and everybody needs to do it on a device. Some, I'm not aware, I just don't know, I'm not aware of whether there are many private sector efforts by the device manufacturers to provide subsidized devices like we're doing with broadband connectivity, but I think something that we obviously need to talk about more. The third reason, and it's actually the highest reason for not connecting, is this very broad bucket of issues that's called, quote, relevance. And that being cited as the primary cost for people not adopting has actually gone up over time from, I think, about I want to say about 30% to 60%, but I need to go back and check those numbers, as the main reason why people don't subscribe to the internet. So this is connecting with Antonio and Christopher and Risa's point. What does that mean, right? So relevance is some bucket of issues that we don't trust the internet. We don't think it's worth the trouble. We don't maybe want our kids or other family members exposed if we don't trust it. We're not literate ourselves, right? If you don't have functional literacy, digital literacy doesn't do you much good. And so I think back to Christopher's point and Antonio's point about you can't have averages, right? You need to, I think, really get very granular. I think we need to get really very granular on stopping using the term relevance and really get in and do some good qualitative research on the various different reasons that different people don't subscribe to the internet. Because if we don't do that, we're going to be completely at sea in terms of trying to figure out how to bridge that gap with, I think, and then to tag on to Arisa's point, with a focus on the most vulnerable populations, because I suspect it's very, very different for different people in different countries and for different groups within the same country about what it is that's keeping you off. So I would encourage us to keep talking about that and do something about it. Thank you.
Can I also add, Andrew, just to add on to Rebecca's point, that, I think the pandemic has also changed what digital inclusion mean in some markets. For instance, pre-pandemic in markets such as Myanmar or the Philippines, where the internet is synonymous with Facebook, maybe digital inclusion meant being able to connect with your community on Facebook or watching some videos on YouTube and the like. Digital inclusion now is social inclusion. Digital inclusion now is economic inclusion, because it allows you to learn online. It allows you to make payments for buying food at the market, or buying food in general because you can't go to the market because of the lockdown, and so on and so forth. It's basically much more integrated into your way of life, and henceforth more important going forward. So I just want to underline that first point. And the second point is to your second question on innovative partnerships for rural and perhaps more challenging areas. I think this should be encouraged for a number of reasons. And as Christopher said, sometimes the business case in these more rural areas, especially on the OpEx front, is not sustainable. And you do need to find more innovative ways to be able to fund that investment. Otherwise, the network won't be built. And if the network doesn't get built, you won't get a connection, right? And in the telco business, you know, the profitability is dropping over the last few years. It's a challenging business case. At the same time, we see that some of the internet service providers or the other service providers, online service providers, have been able to capture more value share, right? So absolutely that there should be more exploration into these partnerships that would then enable connectivity to be pushed out to more of the population, but also, to Antonio's point, to certain public institutions that really need it: the schools, the hospitals, the police stations.
No, thank you for that. Commissioner Fromow, it seems that there are real tensions between the promotion of competition, for example, and some of the other public interest objectives. And how do you deal with those, especially those that may be mutually exclusive? Some of those public interest objectives during COVID. How have you sort of dealt with that in response to one of the questions?
Thank you very much for the question. Yeah, as I told you, we are the broadcasting and telecommunication regulator, but also the competition authority in Mexico for those sectors. Always in all our regulatory decision, we balance both the competition and the regulation issues. And we include some public policy in our decision. But also, I am the chairman of the Permanent Consultative Committee Radio Communication, the PCC2. I don't know if you are familiar with that, but it is part of the Inter-American Telecommunication Commission, which mainly deals with spectrum issues. And since the beginning of this health emergency, we were working in order to identify best practice and action that can be undertaken in order to stop the spread of this COVID virus in the America region, but also how to maintain the communication and how to connect the unconnected. I mean, this is not only an issue in Mexico, this ambiguous topic about how competition sometimes is considered in the deployment of this kind of telecommunication services in an emerging situation. And in this context, we work with our colleagues in the PCC2, and I would like to share with you that we just approved last Friday. We have our meeting last week, and we approved a recommendation called "Important Issues to be Considered when Making Regulatory Policies for Telecommunication during and after the COVID pandemic." And some of these recommendations are dealing with the question you just did. And for example, one of the recommendation is promoting action to make spectrum resources available when the existing radio networks are congested or require tackling greater traffic demand in order to restore access to service when it has been suspended, giving priority to the connection to critical government function, vital services, and strategic connectivity points. But also, we are recommended to boost action that make it possible to increase affordability, availability, and accessibility of service and devices to guarantee the continuity of service, supporting digital connectivity to guarantee access to information and promote social cohesiveness during lockdown. But also, we recommend granting and keeping, to the extent possible, the essential services status to telecommunication ICT services, so that field activities can continue, such as infrastructure installation and maintenance. Also, we are saying that it is necessary that we need to promote an increase in connectivity, facilitating spectrum access for the provision of ICT services, the rapid rollout of infrastructure, access to communication equipment, and the transit of telecommunication ICT staff, taking into account elements such as administrative simplification to grant state or municipal permits, maintaining the verification of terms and conditions, and other ways to exert a positive impact on service delivery. And then enabling universal service funds or assistance funds for connectivity projects in rural, remote, or underserved areas, as well as access to essential services, promoting incentives that facilitate access to spectrum use. In conclusion, we have a lot of recommendations. We are implementing some of them in Mexico right now. So in this context, we want to balance these two sometimes difficult topics. So how to foster competition, but at the same time, how to increase the coverage of our services here in Mexico. Thank you.
Andrew, if I may.
Yes, please proceed.
So 2 quick thoughts. One about devices. There is a lot of discussion about this, and a lot of the attention often goes to lowering costs through reducing taxation, because many countries tax it very high. And there's a tendency to focus on smartphones, and I think we need to think more flexibly. We have to remember, still to this day, about 40% of phones are actually feature phones, and many of us have that blind spot. But actually, in really poor areas, they're using things like Raspberry Pis, a single board computer at $35 to try to connect people, and just think much more flexibly about how we use devices can open up new areas, particularly in areas where they won't sustain. Now, in answer to the specific question you posed about community networks and how you're engaging with Commissioner Fromow, is there a tension between the incumbents and these new community networks and new rivals? Actually, in my experience, the answer is in many cases no, because we always think of that. We have to worry about subsidies and putting public area companies subsidize service in areas which are sustainable by private actors. But in the hyper-rural areas where no commercial company wants to go, the rural areas and the regulators are begging for engagement. It's not a rivalry, it's not a tension, it's actually a welcoming aspect. And what you find is that I think that in those areas, there's a great cooperative move that can happen. And that in fact, the incumbents often, they know that if they can't find a way to solve certain areas, governments will start asking them to do unprofitable things through cross subsidies and different. And so I think there's been a growing support among the entire telecom community to understand that we need to connect everybody, and that there has to be a solution, and that the right solution isn't always going to be to turn to the incumbent, and to try to find that we need to think more flexibly about this, more creatively about it. You mentioned community networks. It's an area that's being very hot right now. We've actually studied them. We have a paper coming on them. I will tell you right now, there's some brilliant examples. I will also tell you, some of them have no sustainable revenue at all. There is one called Sarantaporo in Greece. It's been operating for 20 years on charitable donations. Now, it's a great success story on some level, but I would hate to be sitting in year 21 hoping in an era where the pandemic is causing GDP globally to go down to rely on this. And so what I think about this is, on the other hand, in Mexico, there's a community network called Rhizomatica, which is making it work on $6 US monthly ARPU. And it's not providing the kind of robust service, the high quality service you might like, but the alternative there is not the kind of carrier grade service we're used to. The alternative there is nothing. And so understanding how to manage this in terms of, I always think that the money is often going right now to stand up different models. To me, we should be validating and testing new models and finding out what works. And once we learn what is, roll that out everywhere and start leveraging it. And the last thing I'll say is sustainability, by the way, is not just about money. It's also about keeping the network up and running. Many of these, they initially set up, but unless you train staff that will sustain it, they either need to be upgraded or they go down and they stay down. And so what, as much as part of the money is training the human resource infrastructure to keep things going. One project we're doing in Vanuatu, they literally on this island, the second largest island, Vanuatu, had no trained electricians. I'm not talking about electrical engineers. I'm talking about a person who can wire electric power connections to make things run. And so there's just a level of infrastructure that can happen, and they often turn to what are called barefoot engineers. In many of these rural communities, they have more time than they have money. And so they actually are willing to invest enormous amounts of human resources if given the proper support and training.
Thank you, Professor. Well, we have 8 minutes left. The topic is the digital transformation for all. I'm going to invite all panelists for 1 minute, just to I guess just share your concluding observation on the topic. I think the gaps are clear. The gaps are self-evident. It has been touched on by all. I think the steps have been extraordinary. It has also been commented on by all. The extraordinary growth in data and network traffic, the growth in institutions wanting to finance network and infrastructure development, the interventions that have made a societal difference and impact. So the gaps have been, the steps have been, but how do we, I guess in your concluding comments, how do we take this momentum? Quite a few of you mentioned that it's unprecedented, this cooperation, this coordination, this will, the willingness to get things done. How do we take that forward and celebrate it as we transition into the new normal? So I'm going to start with Rebecca. We go in the order. I guess we now have a defined order. So it will be Rebecca. It will be Commissioner Fromow. It will be Professor Antonio. We'll go to Arisa. And then we will ask Professor Yo just to provide some concluding comments. 1 minute per panelist. Thank you.
First of all, thank you, Andrew, for leading us, and I enjoyed this conversation really very much. I think I'll conclude with emphasizing something that Christopher said in his keynote, which is you need to take this period of time and realize that some things will never go back to the way they were. So we have an opportunity right now to take this sense of urgency and build some systems and use the momentum to actually, I've been, like many of us here, I've been in this space for more years than I care to think about. And I've seen, again, this same conversation about how to have sustainable networks and how to close the gap of deployment and adoption discussed over and over and over and over and over again for the years. And we've got a moment in time that I think if we are creative and we are determined and we're honest, and I guess by honest, I mean we need to set aside some of the old parochial religious policy wars that I think have been going on, look at data clearly as well as we can, and actually put down some of those old debates that get in the way of, I think, action, and work together and actually move and act and do things together. I think that's going to be the biggest opportunity that I hope we don't. There's that old saying about don't let a crisis go to waste. I hope we don't do that here.
Thank you, Rebecca. Commissioner Fromow.
Thank you very much. This is a very important moment for all. We at IFT consider that regulation should facilitate technological and service innovation for the user benefit and give legal certainty to regulated agents in order to increase investment flows that allow them to enter in a continuous and dynamic improvement of the service they provide, but also to increase the quality of services and the coverage of these services. We are working in a lot of regulation in the scope of our competence, but also always listening the industry, the academia, the users, and the international organization, and any relevant actor with a multi-stakeholder approach, convinced that this, if we are going to emit an appropriate regulatory provision, we will make it possible to get as soon as possible all the benefits of this promising future of technical innovation. It is very important because we are, as another country, trying to connect the unconnected and to improve service in underserved areas. And as ITU say, we need not leave anyone behind in this critical moment, that we are going to work with you and other regional organizations in order to have best practice on regulation in order to try to improve it and try to implement it in the best way possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. I would like just to highlight the following three takes away. First one is that there is clearly a change in the consumption pattern, and this change in the consumption pattern is having a clear impact in terms that the digital transformation that we are observing is demand-driven, is not supply-driven. So all the value chain, it's being adjusted to the changes that is experienced by the demand that is coming from the final users. The second thing that I would like to say, after listening especially to Professor Yu, I totally agree. There is a political willingness that is required here. I can tell you that in my experience, only when we are knocking on the door at the very top, and I'm saying directly Prime Minister of a particular country, the project is going to be not only successful, but it's going to have all the involvement of the different institutions, and more importantly, the issue on sustainability is being brought up. That's the second takeaway. And the third one, I totally agree with Arisa and Rebecca that it's very important to think about new innovative models. And here I would like just to put on top of the table, that is not just about public-private partnerships, that it could be one out of many. It could be also about how to take proper use of Universal Service Fund and establish some sort of relationship between those USF and the National Connectivity Plan. We are talking very much about digital agendas, but we are not talking so much about national connectivity plans. Last but not least, we have a lot of public resources such as digital bonds. That is something that could be some innovative way just to finance those digital gaps. Thank you.
Very quickly, Arisa.
Yeah, I think flexibility in policy making is going to be very important going forward. Not being overly prescriptive, so if you're too hung out on 5G, that doesn't do very much for device affordability. If you push too hard on a specific speed target, that doesn't help improve coverage, for instance. So I think a certain degree of flexibility that is more outcome focused will get us there sooner and better to get everybody connected.
Sorry, Professor, but from my side, thank you very much to all, your contribution, your participation. I see we have 5 seconds left. We will switch off automatically after that. Thank you, Professor, for really providing the framework for the discussion and